Episode of One Room Schoolhouse. Today we're talking about, honestly, one of my favorite historical figures. I'm actually studying him a lot. He's kind of the focus of my master's thesis right now. So I've been spending a lot of time studying this guy, and his name is Francis Scott Key. Now, for most of you, you'll recognize that because he's the author of the national anthem, the Star Spangled Banner, or originally what was the defense of Fort McHenry. We're going to kind of skip over that story. We've told it in a lot of different other places. You can go to our TBN series, America's Hidden History. We have on Wallbuilders.com a dedicated DVD telling that story. It's really an incredible story, but we want to talk about him because Francis Scott Key is one of the guys whose statues are getting torn down across the country.
It really is a weird thing going now, because when you look at statues coming down, and there's a lot coming down, it was interesting to me that I went online to find a list of the statues that have been torn down. And when I found a list on Wikipedia and CNN and others, it's very interesting. The statues that are torn down, all they list were the Confederate statues that were torn down. But I've been keeping a list of all the statues that have been torn down, and so many of those statues have been literally of anti-slavery guys, guys that worked for equality. There were actually memorials torn down to blacks. There was a memorial in Minnesota against the lynching, racial injustice of 3 blacks who had been wrongly lynched. They tore that up. Even the Armenian genocide memorial was torn up.
Wow.
What?
Yeah.
And so, but Francis Scott Key is one that is now going down. They're tearing his memorials down, and it's because they don't know the story.
Yeah, they say that he's racist, but they don't know really the first thing about him aside from maybe the fact that he wrote the national anthem.
And by the way, let me raise a question here. Okay, if we make the assumption that he was racist, and that's why the memorial is coming down, and those memorials have been up decades and close to a century, are we to assume that every generation of Americans up to this generation have all been racist and that's why they tolerated him? That doesn't make any sense, because we've seen the civil rights movement, we've seen so much being done to bring equality. And so you would have to assume, if he's a racist and those statues have never been torn down, you have to assume that every generation prior to this must have been a racist and that's why they tolerated it. Or you have to come to the conclusion that maybe the information is different today than what it was
maybe I don't
then.
know the full story.
That's it.
And even one of the chuckles I got over the past week was there was a activist who was saying we need to get rid of the Star Spangled Banner as the national anthem and replace it with John Lennon's song Imagine, which is, not a great song. It's laughable. And so with all this, we need to go back and understand the story.
And by the way, just so you know, in the Star Spangled Banner, in the 3rd verse, and there are 4 verses to the national anthem, in the 3rd verse, it mentions the word slave. And so the reaction is, he said slave, it's pro-slavery, he's a racist, because the word slave appears. Now, we could also point out the word slave appears in a whole lot of anti-slavery documents from a whole lot of anti-slavery people.
The Anti-Slavery Society used the word slave in
all
their
the
title,
So their premise is that because the 3rd stanza has the word slave, it was done pro-slavery by a slave guy, pro-slavery guy, and therefore we have to protest it, and so we'll take a knee, we won't respect the flag, we won't respect the Star Spangled Banner. That's where this stuff is coming from, so it's out of the 3rd verse.
Yeah, and it's really an ahistorical perspective, because as we go back and look at the life of Francis Scott Key, we find that just the opposite is true in his life. Now, Francis Scott Key, who was born in 1779, 3 years after the Declaration of Independence, he was born in Maryland. Now, Maryland is a middle state, which is different from the Deep South, and it's also different from like the northern New England states. They had slaves, and Francis Scott Key was born into a family of slave owners, and he himself owned slaves for most of his life. But with that, he comes in, and Maryland, throughout the course of his early life, is surrounded by states that are abolishing slavery, right? We talk about it all the time, and we talked about it even last week. So many of those northern states completely abolished slavery, and that had a dramatic influence on Maryland. Maryland even passed laws that allowed for people and slaves to petition for their freedom. And what's so interesting is Francis Scott Key, he becomes an attorney, And while he's an attorney, he moves to Washington, D.C., right, the capital of this new and growing republic. He becomes one of the really kind of top shelf lawyers. He's wildly successful. And during this time, what Francis Scott Key does is he decides that, you know, with all of that's going on, I'm going to take on anti-slavery cases without any sort of compensation, so pro bono. And what he would do is he would represent slaves who are petitioning the court for their freedom. And he did this almost 100 times during the nearly 4 decades of his legal career in Washington, D.C. He was one of the most active advocates for liberty in the D.C. District Court. And he was directly responsible for the emancipation of over 100 slaves. Because beyond this, he also advocated for several notable anti-slavery.
Well, I think actually we can say several hundred slaves, because just one incident got nearly 100 slaves free all by itself.
Yep, exactly.
So,
in 1825, he argued before the Supreme Court in a case called the Antelope case, where a slave ship was captured off the coast of America. He advocated that, and he said...
And by the way, the reason that's significant is in 1807, Thomas Jefferson signed a law that says no more international slave trade. America won't be part of that. 1808, the law went into effect, and so here's a slave ship now, slave trade ship off the coast of America by our waters, that not acceptable to America.
Yep, so they capture it, and the question then becomes, what do we do with these captives from the slave ship? And Key goes all the way up to the Supreme Court, and he advocates that by nature, all men are created free. Therefore, we need to liberate these captives and then return them back to where they were captured from. And that's what Key advocates on a national level in 1825. So he spends his entire life advocating for emancipation. And Key also helped start the American Colonization Society. Now, what they advocated was, in order to actually emancipate more slaves, in order to make, you know, emancipation something that even the very pro-slavery southern colonies would do, we're going to open up a way that they can, slaves, if they want to, is all by consent, they could go back to Africa, go back to maybe where they came from if they're first generation, or maybe where their fathers or grandfathers came from. And so Key starts this, and he advocates and travels all around America advocating that, look, if you actually want to end slavery, the Colonization Society will be the quickest and most effectual way to reach total emancipation in America. And it's really interesting. He also frees many of his own slaves. The only ones that he doesn't free, and it's very interesting, is he says that he has some very old slaves who haven't done any work for him for a number of years, and that if he were to free them, then they would be without subsistence. They'd be without money, without clothes, without a place to stay. So he actually just pays them for all of their lodging, all their food, everything. And
he provides everything they need, because they would be on the street, they would be poor and impoverished and probably in their life early. And so while he does free his slaves, it's interesting that from a moral position, he says, I can't just turn these guys out on the street.
Because then they would lose.
That's not right.
They would lose all of the access to money that he has. They would also lose the legal protection that Key gave them. Because this is during the time where you have, you know, Southern slave catchers going up and wrongfully capturing free African Americans and then selling them into slavery in the Deep South. But Key is able to provide a large amount of protection against that. And
it's not like we're trying to justify slavery.
Yeah, absolutely.
This is a really complicated thing, and you can't look at it right now today and say, well, here's what we would do. You should have done the same thing. No, you have to be in that situation, circumstance. And something I think is really important to remember here is slavery has existed in the world for 5,500 years. We've talked about that before. It was not until the last less than 2 centuries that any nation started ending slavery.
Yeah.
And so abolition of slavery is a relatively new concept, and it's so new that there's still 94 nations today where slavery is still legal now.
Not criminalized at all. And in fact, today there are 40 million people in slavery around the world. That's more people than ever in the history of the world. What's incredible is in Africa actually has today the highest rate of slavery globally. There's over 9 million people in chains and slavery right now in Africa. I think it's about 9.2 million, which is interesting because that is equal to the total number of slaves that were sold through the transatlantic slave trade over the 350 years of its operation.
So when we look back at somebody like Francis Scott Key, you can't just take where we are today in the last 200 years, as much progress as we made, and say everybody should have thought like that, because for the 4,300 years before that, nobody thought like that.
Yeah.
So Key is really right on the edge of starting to produce something new, create a new way of thinking, advocating for abolition, freedom, advocating for equality. When you compare him and his generation, he's way out front, particularly being from Maryland. Thomas Jefferson, there was a British guy who wrote a pamphlet about 1785 advocating for freedom in America, and he was a big pro-freedom guy. And then when it got sent to the United States and the tract was pushed around, it didn't get very good reception in the South. And so he wrote his friend Jefferson and said, I thought all of America was for freedom. I thought that's what the revolution is for. And Jefferson said, you really need to understand there's three parts of America. In the North, absolute total abolition, equality, freedom, everybody wants it. He said in the South, they'll never free slaves down there. They won't even talk about it. He said in the middle areas where I am, in Maryland and in Virginia, we want slavery to end, but there's a whole lot of pro-slavery folks. It's a real battle here. And so Francis Scott Key is really in the toughest part of the nation as far as trying to make progress,
and
because
he's leading the fight.
He is leading the fight.
And what we have here is, this is one of my favorite artifacts. We have one of Francis Scott Key's legal briefs. This is not about a manumission case, but it's about a land case. But it's signed by him on the back of it, and you can see, his signature right there, F.S. Key. Very, very neat. It's the same, same hand that wrote our national anthem, which is really cool.
And by the way, he did so many of these cases that the newspapers of the day, the nice way of saying it is they called him the black lawyer. It was really the N-word lawyer.
Yeah, the manumission cases, and like what Mr. David was talking about, he was leading the fight against slavery in the way that he was skilled, right? He was skilled as a lawyer, so he's going to fight it through the courtroom. So he took on so many of these manumission cases throughout the course of his life that he was known throughout the area as, hey, Key is the guy who takes on these manumission cases. So his friends would direct wrongfully enslaved people to him in order so that they could, get their freedom through his legal work. But his enemies, right, would call him very derogatory names, like to say it nicely, like you said.
The N-word lawyer.
Yeah, exactly. So they would call him that, and they would oppress him. And what's so interesting.
And by the way, this is the guy that today's people look back and say he's a racist. He was so anti-racist, the racists targeted him.
Yeah.
And today we've lost all that, and so we're going to tear down his statue.
Exactly.
I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah, it really is. And in fact, one time there was in D.C., while he was the district attorney of Washington, D.C., there was a riot going on. And it was a whole bunch of racist guys who were going through and attacking the homes and businesses of free African Americans. And they were targeting this one gentleman who was accused of a crime, and he was in jail, and Key personally walked out in front of the jail and, really kind of offered himself to the mob, saying, look, you have to stop this. This is not right, and I will not let you harm this man's body, And so Key does that, and one of my favorite stories with Francis Scott Key is it is in 1842. This is basically about 6 months before he dies. So he's an old man at this point. And one of his kind of fellow philanthropists in town, he is a free African-American man, William Costin. He dies. And in D.C. there's a huge funeral that is held for him, and so many people came out to honor his life because he had done so much. He had started schools for fellow African Americans. Key is one of those guys who goes out to honor his friend in this way. And what's interesting is one of the newspapers reports that, right, you have the body that's going to the funeral, but then you have a long line of carriages, right? And the carriages are where the rich, wealthy people are. It's also where some of the notable white people were. But then behind the carriages, you have a even larger group of men riding on horseback, just in the open air during the time of year, is late in the year.
And so this is all part of the funeral procession?
This is all part of the funeral procession. And that entire group of mounted riders are all black, except for one man, Francis Scott Key. He's the only white guy who rides in that part of the funeral that he chose to do. And even a kind of radical abolitionist newspaper who didn't really like, say, the Colonization Society, the newspaper notes that, right, for a person like Francis Scott Key, one of the most prominent, wealthiest attorneys in D.C. and in the nation.
And by the way, he's been presidentially appointed as the attorney for the District of Columbia, which is a federal holding.
Yeah, and this is a little bit after his tenure as DA is over.
So he's notable.
But he is very well known. And the newspaper, this abolitionist newspaper, notes that for somebody like Francis Scott Key to ride not in a carriage, which he very well could have, but to ride in the back with all these African-American men who were also paying their respects to their friend William Costin, was a very significant thing. That's not just something that people do. Like, you would be attacked for that. And Key was attacked and ridiculed throughout his entire life for the efforts that he took to bring equality to African Americans.
And one really notable case that I've always enjoyed is the Amistad case, John Quincy Adams. Now, Amistad is a movie that was done a number of years ago, Steven Spielberg movie.
Impactful movie.
And up front, it all starts in Africa where they're stealing slaves, and so it's graphic right at the front. There's some tribal nudity there. But once you get past that, man, the story is so compelling, it's so historically, it's really accurate. And so John Quincy Adams actually argues that case in front of the Supreme Court. John Quincy Adams, the greatest abolition in that generation. And it's interesting that he wins that case, but a lot of the reason he wins it is because Francis Scott Key gave him the key, literally, to winning that case. Told him what was going to happen.
Absolutely. So we mentioned earlier that Francis Scott Key argued before the Supreme Court in the 1825 Antelope case, but when the Amistad case gets to the Supreme Court, Key actually goes and finds John Quincy Adams and says, hey, you've got to take a look at the Antelope case. I argued it decades ago. I think the Supreme Court is going to rule against you because of the precedent, the bad precedent made by their decision in that case, because they had kind of ruled against Key in that, even though Key had advocated for freedom. The Supreme Court, did a little, judicial activism and didn't necessarily decide in the right way, and Key was worried that the bad precedent would affect John Quincy Adams winning freedom for the Amistad captives. And because of this conversation that Key has with Adams, Adams goes and does a huge investigation into the Antelope cases. He spends weeks reading about the decisions all throughout the kind of appellate process. He reads Francis Scott Key's argument, and then when he gets to the Supreme Court, during his closing argument, he spends a long time dwelling on the Antelope case and about why the Supreme Court had made the wrong decision back then and why they should rule differently in the Amistad case. And it's all based largely off of the argument from Francis Scott Key and the conversations that he had, which is interesting because by the time that the Amistad case is decided, Francis Scott Key has actually passed away. So Key doesn't live to see this victory happen in the Supreme Court. But without the dedication to the cause of fighting slavery, for emancipation, if he hadn't spent his entire life working towards those ends, the Amistad captives would have been enslaved.
So that's a little bit about Francis Scott Key. Now, he's the guy who did the Star Spangled Banner. And we've covered in previous times about the Star Spangled Banner, how it came to be, how Francis Scott Key was on the ship, why he was there, why they held him, and how that 2 days of bombing, the Fort McHenry goes on, and he's trying to see if the flag has gone down because they've stopped bombing. That either means that the British are quitting or the Americans surrendered. He doesn't know which it is. So he's looking to see, and so on the back of the envelope, he writes out that Star Spangled Banner with all the drama of what had just gone on for the previous 2 days with him watching. And so when he got back to his hotel room, he continued writing the poem out. And so when it was published, the first time it was published in any kind of a magazine is right here. This is the first ever publication magazine-wise, and it's called The Defense of Fort McHenry. And it has all 4 verses in there. Now, over time, it became known as the Star Spangled Banner. And so by the time this book, and this is a book of poems of Francis Scott Key, by the time the poems come out, it's called the Star Spangled Banner. And that's what it has at the top here. So knowing that Francis Scott Key was this big anti-slavery guy, pro-equality guy, he really worked hard to free slaves and gave so much of his life to that. He helped other abolitionists win cases like John Quincy Adams. Here's the verse that everybody gets caught on today. And the third verse, it says, "And where are the foes?" Now, by the way, the War of 1812 is called the Second American Revolution. A lot of the promises the British made in the treaty at the end of the American Revolution, they did not keep those promises. And so they're still impressing American sailors.
Which means impressment in a military naval sense means, say, the British Navy would attack American merchant ships, and then they would capture...
Without provocation, without cause. We're not at war with the British. They're just attacking us on the sea.
Basically, it's piracy. They would go in and attack these ships, and they would capture American sailors and then force them to serve in the British Navy. Now, right, they're capturing them and then forcing them to work without pay. That's slavery in many senses of the word.
And it was considered that at the time. And that was the word they used, was slavery. And so one of the things that Francis Scott Key does, he talks about how bad the British were back at the American Revolution. Here we are 38 years later. We still got the same problems. They're still enslaving Americans off ships. And so he goes through, and this is what he says. "And where are the foes, the British, who so vauntingly swore that the havoc of war and the battle's confusion, a home and a country should leave us no more?" The British promised they would wipe us out. Didn't happen then, it's not going to happen now. "Their blood is washed out, their foul footsteps pollution. No refuge could save the hireling and slave." Now, hireling and slave is a phrase that goes back to the American War for Independence, and that's what they called the British. The British used the hireling and the slave to fight the battles. The hireling would be like the mercenaries, the Hessians. They paid other people to fight their battles. And the slave, in the American War for Independence, the British told African-American slaves in the South that if you will come join us, we'll give you your freedom. Nope. More than 100,000 blacks left masters in the South to go fight for the British, and the British only freed 5,000 out of the 100,000. So they didn't give freedom. They kept slaves. They were enslaving Americans by impressment. And so no refuge could save the hireling and slave, and that's the word slave that they react to negatively today. We're talking about the British. The British are making slaves. They're hiring people to enslave us, from the terror of flight or the gloom of the grave, and the Star-Spangled Banner in triumph does wave over the land of the free and the home of the brave. In other words, Great Britain's not going to pull this off. They didn't beat us back then, and they used hirelings and slaves to fight us. They're using hirelings and slaves now, even slaves taken from us, and they're not going to win. So it's a very optimistic look. It has nothing to do about being pro-slavery at all. And again, once you know who he is, you know it's not going to be.
Even in another one of his poems, he talks about how slavery is the only blemish on the American glory, right? And that obviously goes into why he spends his entire life fighting to make sure that America is the land of the free and home of the brave. And he exhibited that bravery throughout his life against insurmountable odds and people attacking him. And right now, all of this isn't to say that Key is some perfect saint, because Romans tells us all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And we could point out in anybody's life, show me a person and I can find you a fault, you know? And so that's not to say Key is perfect, but Key, like you said earlier, spent so much of his life to improve the condition of America. And that's kind of a mandate for us, right? If we see things in America that aren't right or around the world, right? Slavery is still a huge problem around the world. We still need abolitionists today, people to go and fight against slavery and things of that nature. So instead of tearing down the statues of Francis Scott Key, instead of changing the national anthem, how about we learn a little bit more about the man behind it?